Due Process, recipient of 2 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards for Outstanding Talk Show Series and Outstanding Public Affairs Series.
Someone told me the other day the wheel of justice moves slow, and I'm a perfect example of it.
At last, some cash compensation. But can you repay 12 years of a life? An innocent man imprisoned for rape until DNA testing proved him not guilty. More than 2 years now since his release. An update on this Due Process exclusive. David Shephard revisited, up next.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the Legislative Manual.
Imagine this. You're accused, tried, and convicted of a ghastly crime. Now imagine that you're innocent. I'm Raymond Brown, and on the docket for this premiere edition of our 3rd Due Process season, the question that haunts not only criminal defense attorneys like me, but everyone who works in, or looks at, or even thinks about the criminal justice system. We'll talk to a man whose life's work is freeing the falsely accused, and to a prosecutor who says his concerns the guilty who should be jailed. But first, here's Sandra King with a story that's moved all of us here since our first exclusive report 2 years ago. Sandy?
Raymond, it is a story we first told on the first show of our first season, and it's a story that should strike terror in all of our hearts. An innocent man imprisoned for rape for nearly 12 years. And though DNA testing finally set him free, David Shephard lived a nightmare. But he finally has some good news and the same amazing attitude that has brought him this far.
People, I mean, yelling, screaming, yelling, hollering, saying this guy did me wrong, that guy, that's not going to solve anything.
But
that's
the whole
not gonna
system did you wrong. Surely you're angry.
But the system also righted the wrong that they did.
But that took most of this man's adult life. Nearly 12 years in state prison for a rape he didn't do. And even once he was back outside, cleared at last by DNA testing, for David Shephard, the fight for fair treatment was still far from over.
There's no recourse for me.
There's nobody for you to sue?
Nobody. Nobody.
That was because New Jersey, unlike, say, New York, did not allow lawsuits from the wrongly convicted, wrongly jailed. So Shephard found himself on a janitor's paycheck, trying to rebuild a life brutally and unjustly shattered when he went to prison, an innocent man at age 19.
They wanted somebody, and they found somebody, and that's the bottom line.
To make matters worse, the newly released Shephard found himself under fire from yet another official source.
It was like it's one battle after another. You know, the battle with the welfare officers.
That's probably like some hard issues or something.
Shephard's son, Lamar, was just 5 months old when he was arrested in '83. So with David unable to lend support, his girlfriend turned for a short time to public assistance. Money Essex County has insisted should be repaid with late fines and penalties by Shephard.
We have got an order for them to stop taking money on my paycheck, which has been a relief for us. But it's still there.
But the good news is that paying welfare back should become easy real soon.
Right there.
How much are you looking for?
Roughly around $220,000.
Not much in exchange for nearly 12 years, but enough to change your life.
Right, enough to help me do the things that I want to do for my family. Not all of them, but some of them. Gives me a start, somewhere to start from.
It's a start that comes courtesy of an act of the legislature, which changed the law last June to allow David Shephard and anyone else who can prove he should not have been imprisoned to seek compensation for years stolen by the system.
Not until after the interview. The interview we did, the first interview we did, really, I think it piqued people's interest and people got involved, and the letters that we had sent before suddenly got returned.
And after due process first told Shephard's story, the large, quiet man with the steady smile found himself in a media spotlight.
I was sentenced 60 years. I would have to serve 30 years before I was eligible.
Before you could even go on parole.
Right, exactly.
This Jenny Jones show was just 2 weeks ago.
Been on maybe about 5 or 6 different national shows and syndicated shows.
All starting with due process.
All started with due process.
I think he has this kind of personality that attracts people from all walks of life.
And that may be one of the reasons that this year's update on David Shephard finds him no longer sweeping the City Hall sidewalk.
What he does is interview clients, take their application, make sure they qualify.
People accused of crime.
That's correct. This is the Public Defender's Office.
Municipal the City of Newark.
Public Defender's Office.
And there is some irony here. It was a public defender 14 years ago who failed to keep an innocent man out of jail.
I don't think she had the courtroom experience that you need.
And another who helped a decade later to get him out of prison.
He would still be in Yardville.
And the period of adjustment that began with that release is going on still. Shephard loves his new job.
I could relate a little bit of what they're going through and make them understand, kind of keep them calm, and then make them understand what this process is all about.
And he loves his new baby and the son he never had the chance to really know.
Oh, God doesn't give you nothing you can't bear, you know?
But the scars run deep in David and his family.
My father got accused as an older man who had his life together pretty much. Me as a young man with a lot of young men looking like me, just because I'm black, a lot of young men looking like me, they say, well, he's black, he got on blue jeans, they look alike, he did it. It makes me afraid most majority of the time also.
Turn around and look for the, the trap door somewhere, so I get a little scared sometimes when things go to swell.
You still feel like the sky might fall on you again?
Oh, no doubt. I mean, the first time, I didn't do nothing for it to happen the first time. So I've learned that even if you know you're innocent, you have to let other people know. You have to do what you can to prove your innocence. And it's supposed to work in reverse, but I think a lot of times you're guilty and you have to prove your own self innocent.
And given what they've suffered so far, it is probably only natural that David and his son stay braced for the next blow. But at least they're now waiting for that big check, too. And Raymond, it may be too little and it may be too late, but at least it is some compensation for an outrageous miscarriage of justice.
Sandy, the numbers are troublesome. $220,000 sounds like a lot of money, but as compensation for 12 years, it's troublesome.
Well, David says for him, it's enough to change his life. And he's happy that this money will presumably be coming his way. No, it doesn't seem like a lot of money, but consider that prior to the changing of the law, the enacting of this law last year, there was no way to sue at all if you were someone who had been falsely imprisoned, no matter how long, unless there was some outrageous prosecutorial misconduct involved. So the change in the law has made this possible, and the law, for better or worse, says up to $20,000 per year of incarceration, and for David that means about $220,000.
We say for better or worse, but why in fact did the legislature, if they're going to make a change, place a ceiling of $20,000 per year on compensation?
Well, you know that there aren't large numbers lobbying the legislature to do anything for people, even the falsely imprisoned, the unjustly imprisoned. I mean, that is not where the priorities seem to lie in this state, and people don't want to spend money on a lot of anything.
Well, to move from the philosophical to the practical, when is David going to have a check in his hand?
Oh, that's what he wants to know. You know, the bureaucracy moves slowly. We hope not as slowly as his efforts to get out of prison. But it looks like maybe spring or summer. He thinks he may be able to have his family under one roof, which thus far, because of money, he hasn't been able to do, at least by summer vacation for his son.
Well, when David gets his check, then we can maybe move to the next issue, which is how many other David Shephards are still behind bars? That's our question. What's your guess?
I think it's a shame that innocent people do go to jail. I mean, we do have a justice system, and, you know, all we can do is put our trust in that.
I think they should give you back your life that you lost, the money, whatever you would need.
Some innocent people are, you know, in jail, and some not so innocent people might be on the streets.
You never know who did what. Nobody's going to say, yeah, I killed 3 people.
Well, I've been to jail a couple times myself. I know some people are innocent down there.
There's something wrong somewhere if they're putting innocent people in jail when there's so many ones that aren't innocent and they're out roaming the streets.
I'm sure there are a lot of innocent people in jail, and of course it's unfair.
There's too many guilty people on the street. I can't say how many innocent people are in jail.
It is unthinkable, and it's not supposed to happen. But David Shephard is proof that it can and that it does. The question is how and how often. For some answers, we turn to James McCloskey, Executive Director of Centurion Ministries, who's made it his mission to get the innocent freed. To Monmouth County Prosecutor John Kay, whose mission is to lock the guilty up. And to David Shephard's lawyer, Paul Castellaro, joining us from Newark. James McCloskey, let me turn to you and ask whether we're talking about an isolated incident with David Shephard or whether there's a broader societal problem of innocent people in jail.
Well, whenever somebody is proven to be innocent and has spent a number of years in prison for a crime they didn't do, my experience is that law enforcement usually likes to say that it's a rare occurrence, it's isolated, but I think it happens far more often than the public would want to believe and those who administer justice care to believe.
Is there any way to quantify it, any numbers that you can talk about that are meaningful, or is that hard to do?
It's kind of hard to do, but you can say this, that DNA has exonerated and freed. I think we're now up to 45 people in the last 7-9 years who were convicted of sexual assault, kidnapping, and given life sentences, and they were determined to be completely innocent.
John Kay, I know you to be a very thoughtful man and a well-respected prosecutor. Do you spend much time thinking about the problem of innocent people in jail?
As a matter of fact, we do. Okay. One of the things that DNA has done for the community is to find people that are innocent as well as people that are guilty. When we use DNA now, we're looking at stranger-to-stranger type situations, not cousins, stepfathers, uncles. We have very, very few of those. And since now we've determined the reliability of DNA, we test during the investigation process before there is a trial. And believe me, what's happened is we have found that a victim will swear that it was a certain person that did this, and we'll pick them out of a lineup and we'll pick them out of a photo ID.
Which is what happened in the David Shephard case.
Well, correct. I didn't see the earlier part of the piece, but we now have a case where we have to sit with this woman and say, DNA has exonerated this man, because it wastes my time to prosecute.
But let me move a little bit away from the science and the areas where maybe you don't have anything as certain as DNA. Now, I know you're very active in both national and international associations of prosecutors. Yes. And after the seminars, when you're sitting around, I know, drinking sarsaparilla in the bar, do you talk about high on the list of priorities and concerns the question of how many innocent there are in jail? Because I get the impression from Mr. McCloskey that his sense is that it's not a focus of concern as much among prosecutors as he thinks it should be.
I don't know that it's a focus of concern that there are that many innocent in prison. I think that one of the things that we focus on mostly is can we accomplish the truth? And we're mostly concerned about suppression of evidence in both ways, both good and...
Paul, I know you want to join us from Newark. Paul Castellaro, Representative.
What I think the DNA has demonstrated is and proven quite clearly is the real problems you have with eyewitness identification. And in many eyewitness identification cases, you're going to wind up with a DNA is shown that the witnesses simply can't make the identification. And you have robbery cases where you don't have DNA, you have murder cases where you don't have DNA evidence, and there's a whole slew of different types of cases involving identification, and the identifications DNA proves are really bad.
So Paul has raised the question that we really got to wrestle with. If in DNA cases, which tend to be very sexual assault cases, where we can prove it with some degree of directness, what happens in robbery cases and other cases where there's no DNA? Are we sending innocent people to jail there because there isn't a scientific test to exonerate?
Well, in line with what Paul says, David Shephard and the other DNA exonerated people in the world are very lucky, and in my view do not represent the majority of people who are innocent and languishing in prison. Eyewitness testimony is one problem, and in a lot of cases you not only have one eyewitness, you could have 4 or 5 eyewitnesses who, for whatever reasons, either benignly or they've been manipulated into giving false and inaccurate identifications. But it's a common problem that we see all the time in all kinds of crimes and convictions.
All right, well, let me ask you a question that sort of hangs heavy in the air, and we haven't addressed it directly, is what happens when people are executed? That is, capital punishment cuts us off from the opportunity of going back either with DNA or other kinds of evidence, since we now know that there are innocent people convicted. Doesn't that raise almost a fatal question about capital punishment?
It does raise a very interesting question about capital punishment. I would suggest that in any case where the death penalty has been part of the sentence, that any evidence whatsoever ought to be kept, it ought to be subject to testing so that there's absolute confirmation. I don't think there'd be a prosecutor anywhere that would disagree with that as a concept.
One second, Paul. Can I just say one something? You're absolutely right. There should be preservation of evidence. In the Roger Odell case, he was recently executed in Virginia. There was a question of his innocence or guilt, a legitimate question. In that case, there was DNA potential, and no court, nor would the prosecutors or the state attorney general's office authorize that physical evidence to be DNA'd, which both sides agreed contained the semen of the killer. And so he was executed without the ability or permission to have that evidence DNA'd.
Well, how can you have capital punishment at all, John, if in fact we know that innocent people get convicted and that there will probably be some areas where there won't be a certain scientific test that can exonerate them? As long as we know that possibility exists, how can we have it?
It is a problem. I think that the only way you can look at it is to say that the system is not to find people guilty beyond all doubt. It is to find them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. If there is material, it should be tested.
But that means inevitably there is a chance that innocent people will be executed. Is that a price that's acceptable philosophically?
Well, it's not acceptable to me philosophically, but I think that the community and society will find it acceptable, and have probably.
Paul, let me bring you in for just a second. In fact, we've talked in terms of numbers, how many people are there who are innocent and yet convicted. But sometimes there's also a qualitative issue. For example, David Shephard's life is unalterably affected, and no amount of money is going to make him whole.
Correct. There's no way, I don't think you could possibly ever compensate David Shephard. The opportunity, I guess, to get on with his life is the best compensation he's ever going to get out of anyone.
But both he and his son, for example, have suggested in the report Sandy King brought us that they look over their shoulder constantly, fearful of yet another false accusation.
I think it's a problem that a lot of people really don't want to recognize, and it's a problem that I think exists in poorer neighborhoods and in less fortunate areas where the police kind of are the kings in the sense that people are picked up off the street and accused, and if they're not exonerated or there's not some test that helps them out, they wind up accused and they wind up in jail. Another problem I just wanted to point out to you is that Mr. Case touched upon it on the preservation of evidence. There are many cases that I keep hearing about where people will be in jail 3, 4, 5 years and their appeals have been exhausted, particularly in New Jersey. And there's been no preservation of evidence, because once their appeals are completed, the state's permitted to destroy the evidence, or the...
Now, in fact, David's evidence was preserved simply because they were really looking for another possible perpetrator, not because there was a policy to preserve it.
And under the statutes of the state's entitled to dispose of the evidence once the person's direct appeals are exhausted, and which is a process of 2 or 3 years. And we're seeing in the cases that people I've been speaking to that frequently a case is 4 or 5 years old and there's no evidence because it's been destroyed. There's been a destruction order, or the prosecutor's office has misplaced the evidence, or it's been sent to a lab at one point in time and nobody really traced it when it came back, and nobody really knows where it is. And I think it's a fairly significant problem where there's the case initially had evidence that could prove a person guilty or innocent possibly, and it's been lost.
Let me get back to you, John Kay, because you're one of the most thoughtful prosecutors as I know. And the question that continues to arise is, if we have a system which has flaws in it, even though many call it the finest system in the world, how can we have a final punishment like capital punishment, which prevents us from coming back and making corrections, when we know these possibilities exist? And how philosophically are you able to function in a system where I think you support capital punishment?
I think the problem for prosecutors is that they do not have the right to essentially veto an act of the legislature. The legislature says that the prosecutor shall seek the death penalty under certain circumstances, and we're very mindful of the racial aspects of how the death penalty is sought in certain jurisdictions.
Well, if you had to say, if you were emperor tomorrow, would you eliminate capital punishment?
If I were, personally, I think right now I would take the fifth on that one.
An interesting, we like that.
Can I have
Go
one
ahead.
thing about capital punishment?
Sure,
in the last 25 years, since capital punishment has really been reinstated in America, it's been established that we're now up to almost 75 people who were convicted, sentenced to death, put on death row, were eventually freed and exonerated. They were innocent people sentenced and on death row.
James, let me ask you a question then. How does this happen? In a system which does provide, at least in theory, for representation by a counsel of the accused and turning over of evidence that's helpful to the accused, how do we have so many falsely accused, especially in capital cases? How do we have innocent people winding up on death row or in prison?
Doesn't matter whether it's capital or not. It happens in all kinds of cases frequently, and I can give you about 15, but I'll give you a short list of, I don't know, 4 or 5
Give
very
us the
quickly.
top 2.
Very quickly. Inaccurate and or false eyewitness identification, ineffective defense counsel, inexperienced, no money. The defendants are indigent; they have no money. Prosecutorial and police misconduct of one form or another, including suppression of exculpatory evidence. Forensic crime lab people who come in and they cross the line from science to advocacy. They become part of the project to convict. They offer exaggerated, misrepresented, or false testimony that's unrebutted.
John, would
by
you
the
agree or
defense.
disagree with those as principal reasons why we do have innocent people?
I agree with a lot of that. But that's also, the biggest problem is inexperienced defense counsel, I think, because that's their job to point out the problems with eyewitness testimony.
And yet that's not an issue that's widely discussed. Let me get to another issue on which you don't have to have any empirical evidence. Starting with James, could you give us an estimate as to how many innocent people you think are in America's prisons?
In my early days of doing this work, I've been doing it for 17 years now, I used to do that and say maybe 1 out of 10 who went to trial and went down proclaiming their innocence. But I'll even back off from that in the sense of saying, I don't know. I know this, that it happens not infrequently, and it happens a lot. Just in I think it was Suffolk County, the New York State did a study, and they found that there were 60 wrongful murder convictions in a 20-year period that have been recognized as wrongful convictions. Okay. It happens a lot.
Okay. John, with that, maybe I won't bond you to percentages, but have you ever had a case where either it was in your office or another office where you were familiar with the facts and you were troubled by the outcome where there was a conviction?
Yes.
And is there any recourse that you have in those situations?
Went to the judge myself. We managed to void the judgment. And
what about it had troubled you? Was there a particular fact that had troubled you?
There was one particular fact. It involved a test that we did on some footwear, where clearly the defense counsel forgot a major piece of evidence, and I was stunned.
What percentage of your colleagues do the same thing? When they're troubled, take an action?
I think the majority of them do. I mean, they're family people, they're community people. They're no different than anybody else.
And Paul, let me ask you this as we wind down. What is your sense of the extent to which we try to make whole those people who have had this kind of experience?
Well, from what I understand, the New Jersey statute that was passed in August was the first statute that's been passed by any state in approximately 20 years. So I think the public attitude or the legislative attitude to it generally is to just ignore the problem, throw it upon the courts, and let the courts resolve it. And if the courts can't resolve it, then it's basically too bad.
Paul says the public doesn't care. James McCloskey, then we're going to make you emperor and ask you to come up with at least what you think is the principal solution to reducing the prospect of innocent people being in jail.
Well, first of all, what I would do is have the convicted person, when new evidence emerges that indicates that he very well might be innocent, you have to take that evidence back to court. And you have to go back to the original court of conviction. Well, there, they have an investment in that conviction. So we would ask for a change of venue into an adjacent county to try and get an impartial evaluation of this new evidence by a fresh judge.
Okay, that sounds like an interesting suggestion, and perhaps we can get legislatures around the country to embrace it. But I want to thank you for being here. I also want to thank you, John Kay, for being here, and Paul Castellaro. And that's it for this edition of Due Process. But we'll be back next week when we'll turn from criminal justice to family justice and New Jersey's first in the country agreement to give gay couples equal rights, at least when it comes to adopting kids. Till then, for Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown.
I tell you, like I told you the first time, I'll tell you again, I have no room in my life for bitterness. I have to move on with my life. I have to raise 2 children. They have to live in this society. I have to get along with people. I mean, yelling, screaming, yelling, hollering, saying this guy did me wrong, that guy, that's not going to solve anything. That's
The whole
not going to
system
set it.
did you wrong. Surely you're angry.
But the system also righted the wrong that they did.
After nearly 12 years.
But they righted it. You know, someone told me the other day, the wheel of justice moves slow, and I'm a perfect example of it. I think it could have been done quicker. I wish it was, but eventually it righted the wrong at that time, and that's the good part of this.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.